There are moments in life when a man realizes that the rules he was taught to trust no longer apply. Moments when the doors that are supposed to protect families quietly close, one by one, leaving nothing but cold air and unanswered questions behind them. This story begins on a night like that. A night when a father discovered that the system he believed in was no longer standing between his child and danger. It was late, the kind of late where the streets are empty and even the city seems to be holding its breath. Rain fell steadily, not dramatic, not violent, just enough to soak through a worn jacket and settle into tired bones. A single man stood outside a building most people only whispered about. He did not raise his voice, he did not bang on the door, he knocked once, carefully, the way someone does when they know exactly how much they are asking for. Inside, the men who gathered there were not strangers to hard choices. They were older now, their years measured not by headlines, but by scars, losses, and quiet loyalties. When the door opened, they saw a man who did not belong to their world, and a boy who looked like he had not slept properly in days. The father's hand rested protectively on the child's shoulder, not gripping, not shaking, but firm in the way only a parent's hand can be when everything else feels uncertain. The man's name was Michael Turner. He was 52 years old, a mechanic by trade, the kind of man who fixed things instead of throwing them away. His son, Evan, was 9. Evan carried a small, worn, stuffed animal under his arm, the fabric faded from years of being held too tightly during storms, bad dreams, and quiet nights when the house felt too big for just 2 people. Evan did not look up when the door opened. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as if he had learned that attention could be dangerous. Michael did not come seeking trouble. He did not come asking for favors, money, or revenge. He came because every other door had already been closed in his face. The police told him to wait. The agencies told him to trust the process. The paperwork promised safety, but his instincts told him something else entirely. And when a man has spent decades working with his hands, he learns to trust what he can feel more than what he is told. Before that night, Michael's life had been simple, hard but honest. Long hours at the garage, grease under his nails, early mornings and quiet dinners at home. His wife, Linda, had passed away not long before, leaving behind a silence that never quite left the walls of their house. Since then, Michael's world had narrowed to one purpose: keep Evan safe. Nothing else mattered more. But safety became complicated. Subtle at first, a vehicle parked too long down the street, phone calls that ended without anyone speaking, conversations that felt rehearsed, filled with phrases like standard procedure and for your own good. Michael noticed these things because men who work with machines learn to recognize patterns, and when patterns stop making sense, something is wrong. That night, as rain soaked through his jacket and his son leaned closer to his side, Michael finally admitted what he had been avoiding for weeks. He could not protect Evan alone anymore, not against something that wore the face of authority and spoke in calm, measured tones. He needed time, he needed space, he needed people who understood what it meant to stand their ground when walking away was no longer an option. Inside that building stood Robert Hayes, a man in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, calm, and observant. He did not rush to speak. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He looked at Michael, then at Evan, and saw something familiar, not fear alone, but responsibility, the weight that settles on a man when he realizes that protecting a child sometimes means stepping outside the lines drawn by comfortable people. Michael finally spoke, his voice low and steady, not dramatic, just honest. He did not ask for protection forever. He asked for understanding, for time, for a place where a father and son could breathe long enough for the truth to catch up with the lies that were chasing them. And in that moment, the night shifted. Not because of anger or violence, but because a decision was being made. A decision rooted not in rebellion, but in something far older. The quiet agreement that when a child is at risk and the system looks away, responsibility falls to those still willing to stand. This was not the beginning of a fight. It was the beginning of a choice, one that would test loyalty, conscience, and the true meaning of protection. Michael Turner did not speak about his wife easily, not because the memory was too painful to touch, but because he had learned that saying her name out loud made the silence in the room grow heavier. Linda Turner had been the kind of woman who believed in doing things the right way, even when the right way was inconvenient. She was calm, organized, and quietly observant, the type of person who noticed details others overlooked and asked questions others preferred to ignore. Linda worked for a manufacturing company called North River Industries. To most people in town, it was simply a major employer, a symbol of economic stability, a name printed on donation plaques and community banners. Linda never described her job as important. She called it steady. But over time, steady work brought her access to records, reports, and internal reviews that did not match what the company publicly claimed. At first, she said very little to Michael, just small comments over dinner, a concern about environmental reports that never reached the public, a quiet frustration with paperwork that kept disappearing or being reassigned. Michael listened, not because he understood corporate systems, but because he trusted his wife. And he noticed a change in her. She slept less. She checked the locks twice before bed. She stopped using her phone for certain conversations. Linda eventually told him what she had found, not in dramatic terms, not as an accusation, but as a pattern. Data that suggested contamination near residential water sources, internal communications that framed the issue as manageable rather than urgent, financial records that showed consulting fees and regulatory delays moving through channels that were difficult to trace. Linda did not call it corruption, she called it avoidance, but avoidance, she said, still put families at risk. Michael asked her to let it go. He was not proud of that moment, but he remembered it clearly. He wanted peace. He wanted to protect what little they had left after years of working to stay afloat. Linda listened, but she did not agree. She told him something that stayed with him long after she was gone. When harm is quiet, it lasts longer, and when no one speaks, children pay the price. She followed the proper steps: internal reports, compliance channels, anonymous disclosures. Each time she was told the matter was under review. Each time the response came back slower, colder, and less personal. Then came the suggestion that she was misunderstanding the data, that she was overworked, that she should take some time off. Not long after that, Linda died in what authorities described as a traffic accident. No witnesses, no charges, a clean report filed and archived. Michael remembered standing in the rain at her funeral, holding Evan's hand, listening to words about closure and healing that felt painfully disconnected from reality. Linda had never been careless, she had never rushed, and she had never ignored her instincts. After her death, the pressure began, subtle at first. A letter referencing child welfare protocols, a phone call suggesting that Evan might benefit from additional supervision given the recent loss, conversations that implied concern but carried an unmistakable warning beneath the surface. Michael was not accused of anything. He was simply reminded, repeatedly, that systems existed to intervene when families were considered vulnerable. That was when Michael realized the truth Linda had understood long before. Systems were not built to protect individuals, they were built to protect themselves. And when those systems were influenced by money, reputation, and silence, the definition of safety became dangerously flexible. Michael began to fear not just for himself, but for Evan. Not because he believed his son was in danger from the world at large, but because he could feel how easily a narrative could be written about a tired father and a grieving child. He saw how quickly concern could become control, how paperwork could become a weapon without anyone raising their voice. He did not know what evidence Linda had left behind. She had been careful, thoughtful. He suspected she had prepared for the possibility that she might not be there to explain herself. What he did know was that someone believed Michael had access to something valuable, and that belief alone was enough to make Evan a target. That understanding was what led Michael to the door he knocked on that night. Not desperation, but clarity. He knew the law existed. He also knew that laws moved slowly, and fear moved fast. He was not running from justice. He was trying to reach it before it arrived too late. As he sat in that quiet room, his son leaning against his leg, Michael understood that the truth his wife had uncovered was larger than one company or one town. It was about who pays the price when truth becomes inconvenient, and whether there were still people willing to stand between a child and a system that had forgotten what protection was meant to look like. Michael Turner did not expect understanding when he knocked on that door. What he expected was a pause, a moment where someone would listen long enough for him to explain without being interrupted by procedure or polite dismissal. Inside the room, the men did not rush him. They did not lean forward or cross their arms in judgment. They simply waited, and that alone felt different from anything Michael had experienced in weeks. Robert Hayes sat across from him, his posture relaxed, his voice steady. At 61, Robert had lived long enough to recognize the difference between someone seeking protection for selfish reasons and someone seeking it because every other option had failed. He did not ask Michael for documents. He did not ask for proof. He asked one simple question: are you trying to hide, or are you trying to protect your child? Michael answered without hesitation: I am trying to give my son time to grow up without being used as leverage. That answer changed the tone of the room. Robert had known Michael for years, not as a close friend, but as a familiar presence. The mechanic who fixed engines without overcharging, the man who showed up when he said he would. Trust, in Robert's world, was built slowly through consistency, not speeches. He had seen men lie with confidence and tell the truth while barely able to speak. Michael's voice was calm, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly since his wife died. The others listened in silence, men who had raised children of their own, men who had buried friends, men who understood that danger did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived with forms, deadlines, and concerned voices offering help that felt more like control. They understood that kind of pressure because they had lived under it themselves in different ways. Michael did not ask them to fight anyone. He did not ask them to break the law. He asked for shelter, not a hiding place, but a pause, a space where Evan could sleep through the night without fear of unfamiliar voices at the door, a place where Michael could breathe long enough to decide his next move without someone else deciding it for him. Robert stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He did not raise his voice when he spoke. He addressed the room not as a leader giving orders, but as a man acknowledging responsibility. We are not here to replace the system, he said. But when the system moves too slowly, people get hurt. And when a child is caught in the middle, standing aside is still a choice. No one argued. No one cheered. There was no dramatic agreement, just quiet nods and shared understanding. They had all reached an age where noise meant little and decisions carried weight. Protecting a child was not rebellion, it was obligation. Evan sat close to his father, clutching his worn stuffed animal. He did not speak. He did not need to. Robert noticed the way the boy held it, careful and firm, as if it anchored him to something safe. Robert crouched down to Evan's level, his voice softer now. "You holding on to that pretty tight," he said. Evan nodded once. "My mom said it keeps me brave," he whispered. Robert smiled, not sadly, but knowingly. "Then you are doing exactly what you are supposed to do." The decision was made without ceremony. Michael and Evan would stay. Not hidden, not isolated, but protected. Phones would stay quiet. Doors would stay watched. No confrontations, no threats, just presence. Sometimes the most powerful statement a community can make is simply refusing to let harm pass through. Michael felt something he had not felt since Linda died. Relief. Not the kind that solves everything, but the kind that allows a man to stand a little straighter. For the first time in weeks, he did not feel alone. He did not feel like a problem to be managed. He felt like a father whose concern had been heard. As night deepened outside, rain tapping softly against windows, Michael understood that this was not the end of his struggle. The truth Linda had uncovered still needed light. Systems would still resist. Pressure would return. But for now, his son was safe, and that mattered more than any outcome waiting beyond the morning. This was not about outlaws or defiance. It was about community stepping in where distance had grown too wide. It was about men who understood that protection does not always come with authority, and authority does not always come with protection. Michael sat back, Evan resting against his side, and for the first time since the night Linda died, he allowed himself to believe that standing still, just for a moment, might be enough to change what came next. Morning arrived without ceremony. The rain had eased, leaving the air clean and quiet, the kind of quiet that invites reflection rather than relief. Michael Turner stood near a window, watching the light change across the pavement outside, and understood something important. Truth does not rush. It waits for people willing to carry it forward without turning away. What happened next did not unfold through shouting or confrontation. It unfolded through patience, coordination, and clarity. Information Linda Turner had worked so carefully to document was brought forward in the right way, to the right places. Independent journalists received records that spoke for themselves. Environmental oversight agencies began asking questions that could not be redirected. Legal teams reviewed material that showed patterns rather than accusations. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just facts laid out with care. Michael was not part of those meetings. He did not give interviews or make statements. His role was smaller and far more important. He stayed with his son. He made breakfast. He listened when Evan talked about school and dreams and small worries that finally felt safe enough to surface. Protection, Michael learned, often looks like ordinary days returning one piece at a time. As the pressure shifted, the tone outside changed. The quiet urgency that once hovered around Michael's life began to fade. Conversations that had once felt threatening grew formal and distant. Requests became cautious. The narrative that had been forming around a vulnerable family no longer held together when light was applied. Systems respond differently when they are observed. The men who had offered shelter did not claim credit. They did not step into the spotlight. They understood that real strength does not announce itself. It shows up early, stays late, and leaves without asking to be remembered. Their role was not to replace institutions, but to make sure those institutions had time to do what they were meant to do. In the weeks that followed, accountability took shape in measured ways. Reviews were opened. Oversight expanded. Environmental safeguards were re-examined. Funding was redirected toward repair rather than delay. None of it happened overnight, But for the first time since Linda's death, progress moved forward instead of sideways. Michael noticed the change in Evan before he noticed it in himself. The boy slept through the night. He stopped flinching at unfamiliar sounds. He laughed more easily. The small stuffed animal he carried no longer felt like a shield, but a keepsake, a reminder rather than a defense. On quiet mornings, Michael would think about the choice he made that night, the knock he almost talked himself out of making. He realized that courage does not always come from certainty. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion, from reaching the point where doing nothing feels more dangerous than doing something unfamiliar. The men who stood beside him never framed their decision as heroic. They framed it as human. They understood that communities survive not because everyone agrees, but because some people refuse to look away when agreement becomes uncomfortable. They believed that responsibility does not disappear when systems fail. It simply changes hands. As time passed, Michael and Evan returned to routines that once felt ordinary and now felt precious. Saturday mornings in the garage, long conversations over simple meals, neighbors who smiled a little longer, understanding more than they said. Life did not become perfect, it became manageable, and that was enough. The larger lesson of that night did not belong to one family or one group. It belonged to anyone who has ever felt unseen by processes that move too slowly to notice pain. It reminded people that integrity still lives in quiet places, that protection can come from unexpected directions, and that sometimes the people society misunderstands are the ones who remember most clearly what responsibility looks like. Michael never spoke publicly about what happened. He did not need to. The outcome spoke for itself. His son grew safer, the truth moved forward, and the silence that once felt threatening became peaceful again. If there is one question this story leaves behind, it is not about defiance or fear. It is about choice. When faced with a system that hesitates and a child who cannot wait, what would you do? Would you stand back and hope for the best, or would you step forward quietly and become part of the protection that makes tomorrow possible?